Hello, and good day to everyone joining us for today's webinar on the topic of demystifying analytics in machine learning in clinical trials. My name is Kalyani Nayaka, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar, along with Dan O'Connell. I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager at Medidata. I'm really thrilled to be hosting today's webinar with our esteemed group of speakers and subject matter experts, Bryant, Gary, and Dan. Bryant Fields is the Senior Director of the Data and Analytics portfolio. Bryant joined Medidata in 2017 after nearly 25 years in clinical trials with academic and various pharmaceutical companies. He served in several data management and clinical operations roles with responsibilities that span global team management, site monitoring, programming project management, clinical data standards, and HEOR research. Gary Thompson is the Managing Principal of Strategic Consulting at Medidata Solutions, with focus on Medidata's data and analytics products and services. Gary has over 20 years of experience in the clinical research field in a variety of CRO, pharma, and technology company settings. Before Medidata, Gary was the Senior Director of Clinical Data Sciences at Lilly, with global responsibilities for Lilly's clinical data management, eSource, and central monitoring capabilities. My co-moderator of today's panel is Dan O'Connell, Director of Strategic Monitoring at Medidata. Dan has more than 20 years of ClinOps experience from across both pharmas and CROs. After spending 10 years in the industry as a CRA, Dan took on a monitoring systems role at Sanofi, where he headed the management of CTMS, EDC, and eTMF for all U.S. operations. Thank you all for being here today, gentlemen. Today's webinar will focus on three main topics. Over the next 40 to 45 minutes, we'll talk about how to think about data quality and lay the foundation for it from the get-go. What role advanced analytics and machine learning can play in achieving this data quality, and finally, practical approaches for applying advanced analytics and machine learning either in your ongoing studies or in the next study that you're about to begin. Before we jump in, let's start with a poll question. So we've just pushed out the poll to you, and you should be able to see it on the right-hand side of your screen. The question is, what of the following do you find most difficult to identify throughout the study? And please select all the options that apply to you. The options are missing lab samples, potential misconduct, inconsistencies across related data variables, over or under reporting of adverse events, protocol compliance issues, procedural biases, or none of the above. Okay, and we're just about ready to share the poll results with our audience here. So this is very interesting. Of all those that replied, it looks like half of you said that inconsistencies across related data variables is the most difficult to find, followed by protocol compliance issues and potential misconduct. So I'll just open that up to Gary. Gary, did you have any thoughts about the responses that we've received here today, or any other additional comments around why one or more of these issues are hard to identify in a study?
Yeah, thanks, Kalyani. I'd say it's not too big of a surprise to see inconsistency across data to be the highest among these. And you know, it's because, as we know, it's so difficult from a resourcing and complexity perspective to find these inconsistencies with traditional data cleaning methods. You know, historically, they rely on a lot of data point level checks and reviews, very manually intensive and prone to error. And when we maybe use more sophisticated methods like a statistical check, they have to be issues that we're anticipating ahead of time so that we can build the check and make sure to look for that. And it's almost inevitable that it's the inconsistencies that we don't anticipate that surface in a trial that really create potential quality or compliance problems. And these kinds of things are usually found very late in the game, very difficult, complex to correct. So it doesn't surprise me at all that this would surface as the top challenge.
Thank you, Gary. That's interesting. And you also mentioned data quality, because that's really a great segue into our discussion here today. So let's just step back for a second, though, and leave the world of clinical trials and life sciences for a bit, and let's chat about data quality. Why is data quality so key to how we go on about in our daily lives? How does it actually impact us?
Hi, yeah, so I'll take this one. Yeah, I think data quality really is the foundation for everything we do. We're in a very data-driven decision-making society these days, and so really the quality of the data, with the decisions we make, hinge upon that. And so I'm going to draw from an example outside, as you said, outside of the work that we normally do, where I did my first international speaking engagement with Medidata, where I traveled to, Berlin Tegel Airport that I'd been in and out of dozens of times in the past, and I was actually detained by the border control agent because, he spent, an inordinate amount of time flipping through, the pages in my passport book, much like, someone would, look through a paper case report form, I guess, and eventually he found this anomaly, which was quite interesting, where it appeared that I had not left the country at some point, that on one of my trips there were 2 entry points entered and stamps entered and no exit. And I found that interesting, and thinking about Gary's response, it reminds me of that incident, and I actually shared my passport with the audience that I spoke to, a lot of data managers, and no one could really identify what the issue was. But once I explained to them what it was, the response was, well, how did he find that? And I said, no, he didn't find anything. He searched for it. And I think that's, plays well into the mindset that we're going to talk about today, which is, using technology to find issues of data quality as opposed to having to search for them. And as far as the importance, I think, whether we're talking about international security or the safety and efficacy of our products, both of those are very important, and the stakes are very high, equally high, if not more so.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating, Bryant. Thank you for sharing that story. That's really an interesting example of data quality in the real world. But now I'll bring you back into the world of clinical trials, and I wanted to share a survey result that we recently conducted, trying to understand what the top goals of life sciences professionals were. And in a survey of more than 175 people, we found that improved data quality was in the top 3 goals when running clinical trials. So it really is something that applies into our world of clinical trials as well. So what is data quality in the context of clinical trials? What does good data quality look like, and how do you strategize or plan for good data quality?
Well, to your last point, and also putting it in the context of the survey, I find it interesting that, improved data quality is actually sitting right in between, the other 2 very important pillars of project management, which are, time and cost. And I think our audience would agree, if you had, more time, you could certainly find, ensure a higher degree of data quality, and as well, if we had, more resources, we could do so as well. So given that, most of us don't live in a world of unlimited resources, and we're bound by these constraints, I think it's important that we focus and put a great deal of emphasis on really laying the foundation for processes and technology and even people who can then enable good quality. And so what I mean by that is, what is your data strategy around, how do you standardize data, right? Have you put enough thought and effort into defining, how data is going to be used? Who are the key stakeholders? What is the input? Have they given you input into how that data will be purposed? So essentially, I think very early on, we should focus our efforts into ensuring, what are we doing to enable data quality, and not so much what it is per se.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Brian, I think in our industry and spending my, the better half of my career as a CRA, I think when we talk about data quality, we immediately think of, in this context, data cleanliness, right? Because we spend so much time cleaning data. Mm-hmm. One of the coolest things that I've seen at Medidata has been working with the data sciences team around taking those outside of clinical industry perspectives and bringing it back to, I think, what you were referring to before around data structure and so forth, and really talking about what I've heard another kind of cool buzzword in the industry lately is around master data management.
Right.
So is that where this process really gets started? How does master data management, join up with what we're talking around data quality?
Yeah, great point. And so just to elaborate, with master data management, we're really talking about ensuring that we can get to or refer to a single source of truth that is really truly reliable. And yes, that does include, I would say, almost like a ninja-like approach to standardization, far beyond just, sort of removing duplicates, which is an example, or mass maintaining of our data. So this also includes incorporating rules that eliminate or prevent data incorrectness to find its way into our environment. And again, going back to what I mentioned earlier about enabling, once you have this sort of master data management construct in place, then it's much easier and more efficient, and you're more effective in terms of, really being able to make decisions based on what you thought and expected to be truly permissible values. For us, in a very practical example might be, we have over 500, almost 500,000 sponsor site relationships. So if we want to talk about, data quality and compare apples to apples, how sites perform or what certain metrics or key metrics look like from country to country, we need to be able to make sure that we're talking, site A or investigator A, B, and C are the same, across not only within a single sponsor, because I've seen that, that there's no variability within a single sponsor, but across our vast number, our thousands of studies and sites that make up our data repository.
It's great, and I think that, starting with the end in mind is that approach that we have to really start to get out there. I know my personal experience when I was managing CTMS at Sanofi, we did a big database cleanup, and when we got rid of all the duplicates and we got rid of everybody who wasn't assigned to a study, we took 95,000 entries in our database down to 5,000, because that's what happens when it's an open system and you don't have master data management, and therefore, to say it, garbage in, garbage out, right? So Gary, I guess, how does this resonate with our customers today? Do they see starting with the end in mind? Are they coming to grips with master data management before you can have fancy analytics and great data outputs? You got to think about how the data is coming in.
Well, Dan, it really depends. In my experience on the client and their situation, I think the larger ones that have a lot of trials ongoing in their portfolio, a lot of future trials they expect to run, they are committed to the investment that it takes to master data, focus on standards, all those sorts of things. And I think those investments are paying off and making the application of analytics a lot more effective and getting a lot more bang for the buck. I think at the other end of the spectrum, smaller clients that are focused on a molecule or two, and this is make or break for the company, probably don't have as much resources or bandwidth to invest in that kind of thing, because they may or may not see, future return on it. And and they're more focused on quality defined as, this data set I'm going to submit to an agency. Is that agency going to have a problem with it? Can they view it as reliable, good demonstration of control of the study? That's all I really care about, and mastering data and standardization is a luxury I can worry about later. So those clients are a little bit more focused on how do I apply analytics and get a quick bang for the buck and a quick return to make sure that what I'm submitting today is high quality. So I think it depends, again, on where a client is, how much they have already invested in infrastructure and can afford to optimize versus just need to get confidence in a given trial or molecule.
So, Gary, we want to make sure that we bring these terms back to real-life, tangible type of exercises. So we know we have the term of data quality, and we're trying to improve data quality. If I do a data review, if I run my study through some analytics, but I don't change any of the pieces of data that I'm looking at, is the quality improved, or is the quality, do I just have higher confidence? Are these independent thoughts, or is this a synergy that we're trying to bring about when we talk about data quality? How do we break this down a little bit for folks?
Yeah, it's a good question, because we do have customers we work with, and we'll maybe perform a trial assurance and come back and say, good news, we didn't find anything, right? And does that mean they wasted their money on that, or wasted their time on, or that analytics doesn't work for them? No, it doesn't. And what we need to do is think about assurance and quality as two sides of a coin. I think about analytics as a tool that helps us do data quality steps more efficiently, or to do them where humans can't. And so it depends on where a customer is on that spectrum of, can they today produce a quality data set? Do they have the infrastructure and all the data cleaning machinery and roles and responsibilities and work instructions, all those sorts of things ironed out to where they can consistently deliver data? Some clients aren't in that place, and they really want to make sure that they can use analytics to help them bridge gaps in processes, or to make it more cost-effective to get to that level of quality. And so their analytics truly is making a quality difference for them. Other clients, maybe they have the infrastructure in place, maybe they've already been successful in delivering quality data. They're looking for, can analytics give me an additional confidence that what I've got in place is working well, is delivering high consistent quality, and using analytics in more of an assurance way. I think even for those clients, a lot of times they'll see things in an analytics review that maybe isn't highlighting an issue in a given trial, but highlights a different way to look at it, or a different way to approach the process that they then take into future studies, and getting to higher confidence down the road, or maybe even more efficiency because they can do things more simply.
Excellent. I appreciate that perspective. So, anytime we do these, I always want to think, and again, coming from the end user side of this, when folks are thinking about data quality, Brian, what are things that they can start today? How does somebody leave this session and say, you know what, maybe we were thinking about one direction, but really what I'm starting to realize is we need to be focused maybe on that setup, and how do we start with the end in mind? What can they do differently when they go back to work tomorrow?
Well, I think good question. I think it begins with, first understanding what your data strategy is. I think that's something that's not always well appreciated. But I think, again, going back to the first question, more and more people are beginning to appreciate data and the strategy that needs to be invested in it. And so I think part of that, there's a tendency to believe, well, first let's, get it all in one place. You hear a lot today about, data repositories and lakes, et cetera, and then, you have big data, and, these buzzwords are great and popular and well appreciated, but again, you still have to have a, I would say, a cohesive strategy, end-to-end strategy. And so for us, here at Medidata, when we're working with our clients and supporting them, it starts first with, the ingestion, the aggregation, the standardization, and the cleaning. Then moving, once we have all of that in place, then we move into, the analytics that generate the insights, and all of that is enabled, for our customers on our platform called MEDS, or the Medidata Enterprise Data Store, which serves as a single store for data that houses both our clinical and our operational data, and it aligns that with that master data and that metadata that we spoke about earlier. And then once you have all of this in place, I would say, the possibilities are somewhat endless. And I really say endless because, again, data changes, right? When I say data changes, I mean the nature of the data that, we're tasked to ingest and analyze. Also, the regulations around how that data is used is constantly evolving. So we need to ensure that we have an environment set up that facilitates, the ability for multiple stakeholders with multiple perspectives to have their needs served in a very timely, high quality, efficient, and effective way.
That's great, Brian. Thank you, Gary and Brian and Dan, for that interactive discussion about it. So it seems like we are at a point where we have a pretty good understanding of what good data quality is and how to sort of lay that foundation for it. So let's move on to the core of today's webinar, which is really tying all of this back into machine learning and advanced analytics. We hear so much about artificial intelligence and machine learning. They are really the latest buzzwords in our industry. In fact, IDC's top 10 life sciences trends for 2018 puts artificial intelligence and machine learning right on top as shifting into high gear. So let's spend the next 15 minutes or so breaking this down. But first things first, right? Back to our point about understanding and demystifying what machine learning is. What is machine learning?
I got a little scared when you said spend the next 15 minutes, but I'll make the definition at least very succinct. So I'll start first with artificial intelligence, which fundamentally is the enabling of a computing system to replicate what we would consider to be forms of human intelligence. This could come in the form of either some type of visual or visual perception or language processing, as well as decision making. And we see this in imagery. There recently was in Lancet Oncology, I believe in September, some groundbreaking research on the ability to predict cancer patients' immunotherapy outcome based on CT imaging. With language processing, we see this daily in our use of with auto coding. And then with machine learning, there we're really applying AI to pretty much teach or provide a computer system with the ability to learn from inputs or experiences to then generate some outcomes. And sometimes that is unsupervised, we would say, or supervised. Unsupervised might look like processing omic data to generate clusters, or in data quality, in the case that for us, CSA as an example, centralized statistical analysis, making associations. So looking at an entire database and in an unassisted way identifying the relationship between two data points, which was highlighted by astutely highlighted by our audience today in the poll question. And then in a supervised machine learning, there we're essentially providing somewhat large volumes of data to test the algorithm as to giving an input and then some type of outcome. So coding might be an example there. So.
So Brian, I know you mentioned earlier when we were talking about the outside of industry examples, and we talked about, finding versus searching, right? So we have findings, we have signals versus searching for something or searching for quality issues. One of the kind of the pillars of data cleaning, data review, or these data review meetings that we'll have tables and listings, and we'll go through all this painstakingly, line by line, to try to find a trend or an outlier or something like that. I'm seeing like this is an immediate benefit use case without a whole lot of high-level machine learning like we were talking about, but some basic analytics, some basic data structure and analytics. Is that what we're seeing as a use case or an application of analytics, and would it require machine learning to get to that level, or is this even just the low-hanging fruit?
Well, I think, great question. I think it's something that we're all familiar with. We go to these meetings, we have our our output, our summary tables, and then we find this anomaly, and then what do? We go back and we modify the edit check, or we add an edit check, or if an edit check is overfiring, we turn it off, and sometimes we're reluctant to do so. Last example, when I was talking about machine learning and AI, one of the things I was very passionate about when I joined Medidata was, again, centralized statistical analysis, where you're literally taking your entire database and in an unassisted, automated way, identifying the relationship between a date variable, let's say on a visit, and a procedure, and we've all seen this,
right.
How can a procedure be done before the visit? But you know what? It's those little things that we find at the most inopportune time, and it's really how did we miss it, not how did it happen. So this is where, again, going back to the mindset of searching versus finding, this is where I think the power of machine learning and AI is really going to help us make our trials better, cheaper, and ultimately faster.
Yeah, it would be great to go to that data review meeting and really be there to resolve and do root cause analysis on the issues that have already been identified by the machine learning.
And confidently so.
Right, exactly. So, Gary, I think I always, again, try to bring it back in the context of, personal interest in CRAs and how things like this might affect their job. When we think about when we get technology like this or findings like this in the hands of our end users and the folks that are doing this job and working with data on a daily basis, everybody's building visualization dashboards, and everyone's talking about key risk indicators, KRIs. And so if I'm a CRA, I can have a KRI that says Dr. Miller has the most SAEs, per patient than any other site. So that's something I want to address with him. When we talk about advanced analytics and machine learning potentially, because I can sort for who has the most AEs, right, in an Excel spreadsheet. That's not machine learning. Can you give us an example of how CSA and machine learning can bring new findings and confidence to a CRA's daily job?
Yeah, and I think, Dan, that's a really good distinction between the application of machine learning to where it really has a distinct value versus the way that we work today. Because, sure, you could use machine learning to find where we have missing AEs. And somebody could say, well, I can do that with a traditional listing. So why do I need to invest in artificial intelligence, and why do I need to bother paying for the infrastructure and machinery to run those sorts of checks? And why don't I just have a second review if I'm worried about things getting missed? For me, I think the really interesting application of machine learning, to your question, are getting at the sorts of things that would have been difficult, if not impossible, to find with traditional checks. And I'll give you an example. We had a client we recently worked with where on the protocol, they were performing collecting data on a primary endpoint that depended on instrumentation. And the CSA application that we were running, machine learning, and again, to Brian's terminology, in an unsupervised way, meaning it wasn't something we were out from the start looking for, found that there was a correlation between the instrument, so in this study, the sites could have a variety of different types of instruments, and they were all validated and expected to perform similarly. But there was a correlation between which instrument the site was using and a statistical difference in the measure of the primary endpoint. And, you know, so completely unexpected result. Wouldn't have been a reason for somebody to run that check because all of the instruments were valid. So who knows if that was an instrumentation problem or a training problem or maybe a site execution problem, whatever. But this difference was there and could have adversely impacted the statistical analysis of the trial and would have been extremely difficult to find because it was only looking between sites, which a given CRA would rarely be in the position to do, that this difference was found. And so, you know, that kind of a check where we can detect that with machine learning, we can have CRAs go to the sites and inquire what's happening and really dig into the root cause and do it early enough that there can be some correction if needed to why that's occurring. That's the kind of thing that really intrigued me about machine learning and says this is a better way to go at it. You know, I think the other example that comes to mind is where machine learning is just better and more precise around looking at certain types of issues. And you know, maybe a fairly trivial example, but it's the classic, you know, visit window kind of check, right? So, you know, everybody, you know, feels like that we got to check it. We got to make sure the patient's coming in within, you know, an expected duration of the visit. But almost never does it make a difference, right? If they're a couple of days late, it's usually good explanation. Almost every time we have a query fire and that sort of thing, it's a waste of time to pursue it. But machine learning can actually tell you these are the exact times where it's statistically so out of bounds that you really need to go, right? And so you can also look at this as saving the CRA or the data management time from a lot of work chasing down things that, you know, trigger a listing or an edit check that don't actually matter, and be able to hone in on the things that do.
Yep. Yeah, Gary, I'll just add try to add very quickly to that. You know, I got my start working in a stroke unit where we processed CT images the hard way in terms of adjudications. And, you know, I was, again, going back to the example I referenced in Lancet Oncology recently in September and how they're, you know, predicting immunotherapy response. I'm also fascinated just in our real world with things like Instagram last week announcing that, you know, they're going to be processing imaging data using machine learning and AI to detect bullying. And I think, again, these are enormous opportunities for us to apply, you know, technology to what we do in clinical trials in terms of, again, being able to accommodate and process data that traditionally comes with its own nuances and barriers to being automated. The technology right now is just, I think, almost unbounded, and we should be prepared as an industry to meet that, you know, not limitations, but it really go above and beyond the obstacles that we traditionally have faced with technology in hand.
Sure, sure, that makes sense. I think it's time for another poll to just understand from our listeners here today, what types of analytics and machine learning initiatives do you have underway within your organizations? So we've just pushed the poll out. The question is, what are some of the ways you're applying your analytics and machine learning initiatives within your organization? And please select all of those that apply. You're not using it at all. You are using it to observe trends and patterns within data, to improve data quality, to reduce regulatory and submission risks, to shorten clinical trial timelines, to improve operational efficiencies, to discover evidence of new biomarkers, to make clinical trials more precise and accurate, or none of the above. Okay, great. So we've closed the poll, and we're just ready to share our responses. Interesting breakdown here. It looks like to observe trends and patterns within data is the highest in terms of where machine learning and analytics initiatives are being undertaken. But there's also about 20% of our responses here today that are not using machine learning and analytics at all. That's pretty interesting. So once again, Gary or Brian, do you have any comments on these responses? Anything that you thought was interesting or stood out for you?
I'll start. I think it's highlighting a couple things that are interesting to me. So, you know, it's not a huge surprise that 20% of the audience said they're not using analytics at all. Obviously, that's why we have the webinar, right, to try to get some information out there. But, you know, I think our industry as a whole is, while we're making a lot of advances and there's a lot of interest in advanced analytic techniques, especially in the operational side of the business, we're, as an industry, pretty far behind others. You know, the example Bryant mentioned with Instagram, you know, that's prevalent in so many industries where they're using advanced analytics to really fundamentally change the business and their years into that effort, whereas our industry, and whether that's because we're, you know, regulatory driven and therefore a little bit more risk averse, or because the stakes are so much higher, right, and any change to how we do business, we have to be very careful with that we're not adversely impacting safety or accuracy of the data. Our industry is a little behind, and so I think it's a great time to be educating ourselves and looking at where we can make improvements. I think it's really encouraging that 80% of the respondents are using analytics, and you can see here they're doing it in a wide variety of reasons, and both for operational reasons as well as scientific reasons. So I think where we first saw inroads in clinical research with advanced analytics was in statistical results. But lately we're seeing a lot more focus on making the operational aspects more efficient and effective, and I think you're seeing that in this poll.
Yeah, and I just to piggyback on what you just said, I think going back to our first survey that was presented by Kalyani, where again I commented about, I still see, you know, elements of, again, time, cost, and quality here in, you know, how the technologies are being applied. But I'm really interested in, you know, the discovery of evidence using, sorry, it's cut off here on my side. I know what it is. That's, well, using biomarkers down to 2%. Mm-hmm. You know, studies that incorporate molecular biomarkers, there was a publication in 2015, are 3 times more likely to succeed, have a 3 times higher success rate, and when you compare it to those that don't. And when you think about our industry and the overall success rate we have from, you know, early phase 1 to submission, it's just under 10%. Mm-hmm. Just, you know, and with the cost of, you know, biomarker processing and data availability really decreasing down, you know, several orders of magnitude compared to where we were 10 to 20 years ago, I'm really surprised to see this number, and this is not unique to this audience today. That in this session, I've heard this before, but I think I'm going to be very interested to see where we are with this type of poll a year from, even I'll say a year from now, right. Because again, with advances and solutions like Rave Omics, where we're, you know, able to now seamlessly link our clinical trial data, our Rave data, or clinical trial data to omics data, and then apply machine learning and AI to, you know, auto-identify, you know, or clusters, and then use that information, you know, to drive decisions on how we plan and recruit and target patients in the future, and really look at, our endpoint correlations, for example. I think that's going to be very powerful, and I'm very much, again, looking forward to rerunning this poll with this audience in a year or so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. Our industry is notoriously guilty of getting new technologies and new capabilities and applying them to the old way we work.
It's the
right?
risk. We're highly regulated.
Sure.
And again, a lot is at stake here.
Right.
So I completely understand that. But
right.
again, I think we're certainly going to find ourselves in different places.
And we're giving people a reason to collect those things, because now we can do something with the data, mm-hmm. right? So there was previously people weren't necessarily didn't have the technology or the medium to do anything with it. Whereas now we're showing, and in precision medicine and everything that's coming, that there's a need for it, mm-hmm. and we do need to change how we practice.
Yep.
Right?
So kudos to the 2% out there. You are on the leading edge today. Thank you.
That's right. That's right.
You know, Dan, I think one other comment I'd make here with regards to the relative slowness of our industry to adopt these methods, and here the 20% that responded they're not doing it yet. You know, to really make advanced analytics effective and valuable from a cost standpoint, you have to not only apply them, but you have to quit doing the things you've been doing in the past. And I think that's really the barrier in this industry. It's developing the trust and confidence that new techniques are adequate to replace and you know, traditional methods, and have us stop doing those things. I think that, Bryant, when I think about will this be different in a year, I think it really depends on us as an industry being able to demonstrate we've crossed that threshold.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, you know, to that point, you know, the one thing I wanted to ask you both, and Brian, get an understanding from you from the intended use, and Gary, an understanding from you of how it's being realized today with even our most progressive customers and sponsors out there. But it seems like there might be a bit of a tug of war here, right, with the holistic and overview of analytics and looking at all the data, you know, at a macro level. And are we losing sight of the individual patient profile and safety, you know, that we have to be concerned about? I think the folks that even say that they're not using analytics today at all, maybe they don't consider a patient profile to be analytics, but I believe it is. And you're aggregating data about a subject from different places. So I would just be curious, Brian, your take on the intention of how to have a mix of these things. So it's a synergy and not a tug of war. And then Gary, what you're seeing, you know, real life in application.
Yeah, I think you know, for me, I look at my portfolio as kind of like the shiny new app, the shiny new thing.
Right.
Right. And it's very you get a wide range of reactions when we speak to, you know, our clients about the shiny new things in our portfolio. And so I think it's, you know, there's a temptation to sort of overcorrect and say, great, if we go out and run with all of these things, we're going to have a real sort of high-level, very sophisticated view of the world and view of our data. But ultimately, it does come down to the patient. And I think at some point, every company realizes there's a sort of dialing back or dialing up in terms of how you look at data. So starting with, let's say, an integrated data review. You know, I think these technologies are absolutely great in terms of, you know, providing a total view of a data point. You know, you can have someone who owns it, but, you know, there are people, you know, there are various roles have a stake in every data point. Right. And I think our technologies enable our customers and our clients and our sites to actually have that sort of that complete view of the data. And again, it's a balancing act. Ultimately, you know, no single data point, you can't, I used to say one study does not a submission make. Right. And the same thing goes with your data points. It's a collection, and at some point, you know, it doesn't happen overnight. There's a progression of data processing and data quality, and technology enables that. I just think it enables it sort of more of a parallel approach, and yeah, that's what I would add.
Yeah. And Gary, your take on what you've seen out there with customers?
Well, yeah, and again, kind of consistent with this poll, we have customers that are all over the map in terms of whether they're using analytics and to what extent. And you know, on the one side, are customers who really get this, who've made a commitment to it and are investing in it, and are not just applying it to their clinical trials, but are relying on it and backing off of some of the traditional methods that they've seen aren't adding as much value. It's kind of like the argument I think that's already been made pretty well by Transcelerate and others around source data verification, right? That the data shows it's really not that effective. And why do we keep doing it? It's because there's not a great alternative. Well, analytics starts to get you those kinds of alternatives. And just as we're seeing clients start to be more selective and when they're doing SDV, maybe move to more of a statistical sampling method, we're also seeing that on other types of quality steps, you know, whether it be traditional edit checks or data reviews, where, you know, analytics can take the place of those sorts of things. They're able to stop doing some of those other, and that's where the return on investment is coming for those clients. The other side of that spectrum is, you know, companies that say, wait a minute, this is a business about the patient. We should be focused on the patient, and, you know, big data, big analytics. That's feels a little foreign to what we're here for. And you know, I don't agree with that in terms of advanced analytics are a great tool to augment what we're doing. But yes, the point of it's still about the individual patient and ensuring that we're producing drugs that work for the individual and are safe for the individual matters a lot. And to your point, it's not just big data that's a means of getting at that. I think a really well thought out visualization of an individual patient's data is a great example of advanced analytics. And I think there's a lot of application and room for improvement in using analytics at the patient level into the spectrum as well as the big data end.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. You know, there's another IDC survey, a data and analytics survey that talks about the majority of spending, almost 71%, by life sciences companies is being focused on near-term initiatives within the next 2 to 8 months, likely with predefined goals and certain expectations and return on investment as well. So, Gary, I think we're at a good point to switch to our next segment to kind of bring everything that we've been talking about together, talk about practical ways of applying machine learning and analytics into an ongoing study or into the next study. But it seems like that will only happen if there's some kind of a short-term impact. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, you know, there's not many companies that have the luxury of putting in a soup to nuts analytics initiative. And, you know, back to Brian's comments about data mastering and standardization, it can take some years of serious investment to be able to get the full benefit of those kinds of investments. And yes, we do have some clients who have taken that approach, and the ones that committed to that approach years ago are starting to see tremendous value from that. But a lot of clients aren't in that position. They need to see some kind of return immediately. And so we focused a lot on how do we provide the stepping stones along this path of how clients can get benefit right away. And that benefit might come from higher confidence in what they're submitting, and the value to them is that they have higher probability of success when they go to submission. We've had a couple of examples where, you know, we can do a head-to-head with the client on a protocol that they ran CSA on and one that they didn't, and had problems on the one that they didn't when they got to submission versus the one that they did, because they were able to catch some issues and avoid those. The return on investment also might come from really being aggressive with implementing some lower-hanging fruit aspects of process improvements that advanced analytics can help with. You know, again, being able to stop doing some activities and turn those off and getting savings in that perspective. I think regardless, it's really important that a company understand its tolerance for investment and really understand what needs to happen sequentially in order to get to a return, and make sure that they can demonstrate that, and then build their expectations and their approach to implementation in line with that.
Yeah, Gary, And to add to that, you know, I would say, you know, I've spent some time in an HEOR group, I think is mentioned in my bio earlier, and, you know, data, you know, value, which I consider to be the fifth V. We talk about, you know, the 3 Vs with big data, variety, volume, and velocity, and then there was the 4th V, which was veracity, but then there's, you know, sort of value. And when we're talking about that investment, you know, I had a great opportunity to look at, again, where commercial data is being, you know, the importance of commercial data. And here at Medidata, we're doing some great things in that space as well. But, you know, value is extremely a very important aspect of the work that we do, and sometimes there really isn't that direct correlation, and we can't necessarily make the business case on data management. But you know, Dr. Daniel Croft said something about 3 or 4 years ago at a conference I attended. He's with Singularity University, where he said, you know, data is the currency of our industry. And the connection that I made to that, and that he made as well, is that, you know, when we think about, you know, our label, which is what faces our customers, that label tells, you know, the industry, it tells our regulators, it tells, you know, the prescribing physicians and the person ultimately taking those treatments, you know, what to expect and what not to expect. And that's all based on data. Those listings, those tables, the years of data collection, data aggregation, everything we talked about, you know, is really summed up on that label based on the data. And so I think to the extent, going back to, again, the very first infographic that you shared on industry perceptions and what's important, although data quality was somewhat, you know, was on the, I think, the 3rd highest ranking, I think fundamentally, you know, the value of data spans pretty much every category, even the site enrollment. You don't have good, which I think was number 1. If you don't have good site enrollment data quality, then that even that metric is off. So that's all I would add there.
Great, awesome. So in the couple of minutes we have left here, and again, not meaning to end on a negative note, but just a general question about, we've talked about all these advantages of utilizing machine learning, but are there any limitations as we begin to think about getting into this?
Well, you know, one limitation, you know, big data implies that there's a certain amount of data to be analyzed, but it also implies there's a lower threshold. You have to have a certain amount of data in order to be able to make the inferences that we've been talking about here. Thankfully, it's not as big as you might think. It's, you know, our experience has been about 50,000 data points, which sounds like a lot, but on a typical trial that gets met somewhere between 25 and 50 patients. So even smaller trials can benefit from advanced analytics. I think if you're talking about trials much smaller than that, you know, probably we're needing to look at other kinds of methods, and especially visualization techniques as the better route to go.
Got it, Gary. Thank you. We do have a couple of questions that have come in from our audience members, but if you have any questions that we did not address in our topics today, please use the chat pod to ask your questions for panelists. So I think we just have 1 minute to address one of the questions we have in here. And Gary, maybe you touched on this a little bit, but is machine learning, is this initiative just that good for big studies, large companies? What about smaller studies, which, you know, a small phase 3, 2 subjects per site, 200 sites kind of a study? How relevant is machine learning there?
So it's still very relevant. So I heard you to say, Kalyani, a small phase 3. Maybe a couple of patients per site, and that may describe, you know, a typical oncology phase 3 study, right? Where oftentimes we're going after a lot of sites with relatively few patients per site. I think there, the thing to be aware of is there are aggregations of data along the way that you might be interested in. So if you're looking at variation within a site, having 2 patients per site isn't a ton of data to be able to really look at meaningful variation within that site. But a lot of the analytics are pulled across the trial. And again, that's the beauty of it, is it's the kinds of things that a single CRA would be very hard-pressed to notice and identify. And so even if it's just a few patients per site, anything that's above, 25 patients or so in total, you're still going to get a lot of application for advanced analytics. You just need to be smart about where to apply it and knowledgeable about what the limitations are.
Got it.
So I do want to, before we wrap up, I am curious. I was just at the SCRS, the site summit this past weekend, and everything we do, we always try to bring back to the patients and the sites. And obviously for us, most of us, our sites are conduit to the patients still at this point before we get to full virtual trials, right? As we look at this and we look at the advances in analytics and machine learning and the technologies we're talking about, how do we see it? Not in the virtual trial sense, but how do we see it bringing value to our sites? How are our CRAs and our sites and our sponsors and our sites going to interact differently to bring value to sites? Because they want to know what's in it for them.
Yeah. So I think, something I've said before, which is, happy patients, happy sites, and vice versa. When we're able to now use analytics for, informing our, protocol design, I think this is using objective information, right? So we're able to now, use analytics to, determine, which procedures are, associated with either real or perceived burden on a patient.
Sure.
Well, that certainly impacts, a site's performance in terms of their ability to be looked at as a site of choice, not only by patients but also by sponsors. So I think what we're doing now with advanced analytics in terms of looking at, again, historical data, not just from the study level but all the way down to the procedure level, and making the associations with patient and site burden. These are really everyday, in the field improvements that not only, impact the bottom line for, let's say, our sponsors, but directly impact the experience that they have at the sites and how they view our sponsors and clients.
Yeah, I agree with that, Brian. The other thing I would add is, most of the sites that we work with are really hungry for data about how they're performing, and not because they want to compete with each other per se, but because they want to do a great job and they want to know how their performance is relative to other sites on the study for, the purpose of knowing what I need to improve on, what am I already doing well at, need to focus. And kind of advanced analytics makes that a lot easier to help sites with that information.
Yeah, the head of product development of one of our majors actually was in with us, and I love the way he summed it up. He simply said, we believe we're great at enrollment, but we're not so great at retaining. And he said, I'm not sure if it's the sites that we're selecting or the protocols that we're giving to them. Right. And again, our ability to use analytics across cross-industry data to generate these insights, it really makes a big difference and an impact. Again, going back to, we have a lot at stake here, and we just want to make sure that we're applying the best technologies to make sure we're getting the right questions, the right questions answered as effectively as possible.
Yeah, I keep holding out hope that when we realize that the sites are the ones that are doing the data entry, they're doing the lab draws, they're doing the analysis, they're pulling the images, and they're the reason we have all of this data, that when it's as easy as it is now to, analyze and draw conclusions, that we start to give them some insights into it as well, right? Sharing patient profiles and sharing, performance information, stuff like that. when they're on the front lines every day. I think that level of transparency, I mean, like I said, been doing this a long time. There's an adversarial relationship still out there between trying to catch the sites doing something wrong, right? The question of, are you using this to find misconduct or whatever, as opposed to how can we improve patient safety? How can we improve even the efficiency of our protocols that you're talking about? Yes. So hopefully, you know, we can start to change that paradigm a bit and and it's more of an information sharing now that the information is more readily available. Absolutely.
That's great. That's great. I mean, clearly 60 minutes is not enough to talk about this topic. And so we will continue this conversation next week at Next New York. That's taking place in Spring Studios. We'd love to see you there. Please register to attend if you haven't done so already. But thank you so much for attending today's session, and to all of our panelists. Looking forward to seeing you next week, and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.